Good morning. Welcome, everyone. I'm Katherine Jacobsen, the United States and Canada Program Coordinator at the Committee to Protect Journalists. Today, we'll be discussing CPJ's new report about the Biden administration's approach to press freedom at home and abroad. You can now find our report at cpj.org with translations into multiple languages. This report is the third in a series following reports on both the Obama and Trump administrations' relationships with the media. In addition to CPJ's ongoing reporting and advocacy on press freedom in the U.S., we are also a co-founder of the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker. The tracker data from the past 2 years shows an unprecedented number of arrests and attacks on journalists working across the United States. CPJ's newly released Biden report, along with the previous two reports, were authored by Leonard Downie Jr., who joins us today for our panel discussion alongside CPJ's Deputy Executive Director, Robert Mahoney. Kirsten McCudden, Managing Editor of the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker, has had something come up and is unable to join today. Downie was a reporter and editor for the Washington Post for 44 years, leading the newsroom as executive editor from 1991 to 2008. He has written and co-authored 7 books, most recently his memoir, All About the Story, News, Power, Politics, and the Washington Post. He currently serves as the Weil Family Professor at Arizona State University's Walter Cronkite School of Journalism. We also have Rob Mahoney, who has been the Deputy Executive Director at the Committee to Protect Journalists since 2007. Prior to coming to CPJ, Rob worked with the Reuters news agency around the world. He headed news bureaus in Jerusalem, West Africa, and Germany, and also served as news editor for Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. This April, Columbia Global Reports is publishing his book, co-authored with former CPJ Executive Director Joel Simon. The upcoming book is titled The Infodemic: How Censorship and Lies Make the World Sicker and Less Free. A few quick housekeeping notes before we begin. Len will give a short presentation about his findings from the Biden report, and then Rob will present CPJ's recommendations to the Biden administration based on the report findings. After these presentations, I'll be moderating the question and answer portion of today's briefing. For the Q&A section, you'll be able to unmute and ask questions. If you have a question, please use the Zoom function to raise your hand virtually, and we will unmute and call on you. If audio is not possible, you may submit your question via Zoom Q&A or via the Zoom Q&A function. With all questions, please be sure to state your name and affiliation beforehand, and a reminder that this conversation is being recorded. Without further ado, I'll hand the floor over to Len to speak about his report findings. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Catherine. First, I'll start with the good news. The good news is that the first year of the Biden administration's relationship with the press has been a complete reversal of the Trump administration's unprecedentedly pervasive and damaging hostility to the press. Every journalist that I talked to for this report wanted to bring that up first. They have a totally different atmosphere in which they're working with this administration, despite the fact that they still have several criticisms and concerns about that relationship. The big change has been in part in the rhetoric about the news media. The president and the White House press secretary and people working for them have all made quite clear that they have a strong belief in the role of the news media in the American democracy, quite contrary to the previous administration. There have been significant improvements in the day-to-day relationships that the administration's press offices have with reporters. Much more professional operations, much more courteous. In fact, more courteous than the Obama administration, when reporters frequently complained about the way in which people in the press office there berated them and their editors, as I can attest. The daily press briefings have been restored at the White House and the State Department and the Defense Department. You would think that's normal, but that, of course, was not going on all the time during the Trump administration, and is once again normal during this administration. There's been increased access to cabinet secretaries and other officials, many of whom have also been available for television and radio interviews in many more occasions than during the previous administration. Attorney General Garland has taken a major step in issuing a memo that stopped the federal subpoenas of records of telephone records and email records of reporters in leak investigations. This still has to be promulgated into instructions to the U.S. attorneys around the country. That needs to be watched closely to make sure that that the intent that we understand the Attorney General to have is carried out in those orders. President Biden has restored the editorial independence of the U.S. Agency for Global Media, the home of VOA and other radios. This is extremely important. The Trump administration tried to turn that into a propaganda agency for the United States, and it was immediately restored when President Biden took office and fired Trump's head of that organizations. And the Justice Department is committed to investigating attacks on journalists in the United States in its investigations of the police forces of some cities around the country and in other instances. And that's very important. That was not going on previously. Now for the not such good news. Reporters have less direct access to President Biden than they expected, and less than the rhetoric would indicate. He's had only one full-scale press conference in the White House itself, another 4 during visits to foreign countries. He's only given 22 interviews to news media during his first year, compared to 92 for Trump and 150 for Obama. He has answered questions more often to reporters in informal settings after giving prepared speeches, but he's answered far fewer questions during them, and ends them very quickly, or they're ended very quickly by the press aides that are at his side. The press offices and at the White House and the cabinet departments and agencies still tightly control access to government officials. If you want to interview somebody, by and large, you have to go through the press office. Sometimes the press office even monitors those interviews. Too many briefings and interviews with senior administration officials are on background, which means that they cannot be quoted or named in stories, or if they are quoted, only quoted as a senior administration official, which really hurts the credibility of those news stories when readers don't know who it is that they're being quoted, and enemies of the media can say, "Well, see, that's fake news," because there are no names attached. Not a good thing. Freedom of information experts have not yet seen any improvement in the administration's handling of FOI requests from reporters, and this administration's been silent on whether or not it's going to make any improvements. The administration has continued to seek the extradition of Julian Assange to stand trial on an espionage case, which is very troubling to the news media and to press freedom advocates, because it means that the revision of the indictment of him for espionage describes activities by him that are exactly the same as activities by reporters doing their jobs. And so as long as that case continues, it's a worry that could be used against journalists in other situations. Press freedom advocates have also been disappointed by the administration's reaction to the cries for help for endangered Afghan journalists who are still inside the country, and efforts to get them out. And finally, there's been uncertainty about whether or not the administration is going to back up its rhetoric to work on press freedom around the world and globally. And until in December, they finally did decide to provide certain grants of money to a number of international organizations that work on global press freedom, but that's the only action that appears to have been taken so far.
Thank you so much for the presentation on your findings. Rob, Len gave us some insight as to what he found this past year during the course of his reporting. What does CPJ make of these findings, and can you speak to CPJ recommendations for the Biden administration? Thanks.
Yeah, good morning, Len. Good morning, Katherine, and all our colleagues who've joined us. Let me begin by saying that Len's report is the report of a journalist, and it's his work. And CPJ has appended to his report our recommendations. Len did not write these recommendations. There's a line between the two. Picking up on some of the points that Len made, let me just say that the global context for this report is one of extreme danger for journalists around the world. We have record numbers of journalists in jail globally. That's more than 300, we believe. Journalists are being killed, murdered with impunity for their work. That's the background against which this report is written. And we, as press freedom advocates and journalists, need the United States to stand up and affirm values of journalism, First Amendment values, freedom of the press. It cannot do that credibly on the international stage if press freedom is not fully respected at home in the United States. So that's one of the reasons that we want to acknowledge the great improvement that has been made since the Trump administration, but also highlight some of the improvements that Biden still needs to make. I would pick up on access to information, which Len mentioned, whether it's on the record briefings or the timely processing of Freedom of Information Act requests. Journalists have a right to access public information. Far too much information in this administration and previous ones is classified, hidden behind a wall. We need to be able to access public information and in a timely manner and get those documents which aren't heavily redacted. We also have been tracking for many years a worrying trend of journalists being stopped while entering the United States by Customs and Border Protection officers, interrogated as to why they are, where they've been, why they're coming in, and sometimes having their phones and other electronic devices taken. When they're taken, they can be easily read by the government. They can find out journalist contacts, where they've been. And this is a situation which was highlighted last year when we saw that journalists were being spied on, as it were, when they come through the border. That has to stop. And we would also urge the administration to make it easier for journalists to access the U.S.-Mexico border, especially when big stories are unfolding there with migrants trying to come into the United States. Len also mentioned Afghanistan. We were shocked to see the disorder and human suffering that took place from August of last year when the United States precipitously withdrew from Afghanistan. We at CPJ have been helping Afghan refugees trying to get out of the country and bring out those who are in danger that are still in. And we would call on the U.S. to expedite the processing of so-called P2 visas, which allow for journalists that have been stuck in Afghanistan or are in camps outside of Afghanistan to get into the United States, especially those who are targeted by the Taliban or who have worked for US affiliated outlets in the past and could be in danger. We also recommend that the Biden administration drop its proceeding against WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange, drop charges, stop seeking his extradition. There are incredibly harmful consequences for the use of a First World War era act, the Espionage Act, against journalists around the world. And it is comfort to dictators around the world who try to do the same thing using spy act and espionage acts and national security laws to try to silence critical voices and stop information from reaching the public that deserves to see it. Spyware is also something that we are concerned about, and we welcome the moves that the Biden administration has already made towards stopping US companies assisting in the development and spread of spyware which is used to surveil journalists and their sources. And finally, we would call upon the US to take meaningful political and diplomatic sanctions against Saudi Arabia for the brutal murder by the Saudi regime of a Washington Post columnist. Those are the main points that we've taken from this report. There are many others, and I would like to thank Len for a tremendous piece of work. Thank you, Katherine.
Thanks so much, Rob. With that, we'll segue into our question and answer portion. Just a reminder to please use the Zoom function to raise your hand virtually, and we will unmute and call on you. If audio isn't possible, you can also submit your question via the Zoom Q&A function. With all the questions, please be sure to state your name and affiliation beforehand. Just to get us kicked off as we kind of work the technical side of that, Len, I was wondering, with decreasing approval ratings at home and myriad of issues surrounding COVID, et cetera, and other domestic problems, do you think that we'll see the Biden White House attempt to control the narrative more, or do you think it's possible that they might be more open to having more on the record briefings with journalists, that sort of thing?
I see no sign so far of increased access to the president. In fact, my guess would be that as inflation and COVID and so on create increasingly political problems for him and for the Democrats, that his advisors will be as there's a woman named Martha Kumar who is in the White House basement near the news media, who counts all these things. She's the source of all this reliable information about numbers of press conferences and interviews and so on and so forth. And she's been doing this for several administrations, and she knows she has a lot of good contacts inside the White House. And her belief is that they're going to continue to be very careful about how much Biden talks to the press, how long these little informal questions and answers are, which only seem to be a few each time, and not having very many press conferences, not having very many interviews, because they're worried about him making mistakes. And they might be more worried about that now than ever with the pressures of increased COVID and inflation.
Thanks so much. And I see that Diego has a question that he wrote out in the Q&A section. I think we're going to unmute him now so he can ask. If you don't mind, Diego, identifying yourself and your affiliation. Thanks.
Sure. This is, can you hear me okay? This
yes,
is Diego
yes,
Barban from Hearst. Thanks for the report. It's always good to hear that things are changing at the top line level. My own work is more at the local level, and I wonder whether you've gotten any impression whether the change in rhetoric at the top is having any impact at the state and local levels. My sense is that it's not, and that the problems of the last several years at the federal level have really manifested in much more concerning ways at the local level than in my memory. I just wonder if you have anything you can add on that.
Well, from my observations, it appears that places where there are conservative Republicans in charge at both the state and the local level, relationships with the press are still very bad, if not getting worse. I see anecdotal evidence of that all the time in coverage of things that are going on. Whereas in areas that are where Democrats seem to be in charge, where there's more of a tradition of a better relationship with the press, maybe New York State accepted under Governor Cuomo, there seem to be better relationships with the press, and I think that what's coming out of Washington can have some good influence on that.
Great, thanks so much. Did that answer your question, Diego?
Yes, thank you. Thanks.
Okay, great. Just a reminder that you guys can raise your hands virtually or drop a question in the Q&A thing.
If I can add one more thing, Catherine, what I thought about with Diego's question. What also concerns me is that left over still from the Trump years, and in fact encouraged by Trump himself these days in his conversations with people, is that there still are many too many people who are attacking members of the press. Attacking them online and sometimes in person, and this is a great concern. Many of the reporters I interviewed, particularly the women reporters I interviewed, this is a terrible part of their job, is to be subjected to these attacks and threats all the time, and that is continuing. And the former president could stop that if he chose to do so, but clearly he's not, and it's difficult for the current administration to change that.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. And just to tack on there, the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker, which CPJ co-founded, and I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, has comprehensive statistics on the numbers of assaults and arrests across the country. So I would highly recommend checking there. We'll drop a link in the chat. Our next question, I think, is Lauren Gambino. You've raised your hand. If you can unmute yourself and ask, that'd be great.
Hi, thank you. I'm a reporter with The Guardian here in DC. I was just wondering, when the issue of news conferences comes up with White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki, she sometimes says, she obviously defends it and says Biden answers questions frequently, and then she says, she has said the American people don't really care about news conferences. They see the president often. He does take questions from you guys. And I guess I was just wondering if you could kind of spell out what the importance is of these news conferences, why Biden just taking a couple questions here and there don't cut it and aren't the aren't the norm, and why maybe the American people might care that he's not doing that?
Sure. And by the way, Jen Psaki said the same thing to me when I interviewed her at length for this report, that in total he's answered questions for the press on more occasions than the previous presidents had. The problem is that the answers are short and there aren't very many of them, and then he moves on, or they move the press on. Full-scale press conferences, there are issues with them. There is grandstanding by some members of the press. A president can filibuster if he or she chooses to do so, et cetera. However, this is still the only opportunity for large numbers of the press who cover Washington, who cover the administration, who are knowledgeable about what they're doing, to be able to ask questions and follow-up questions in depth. In a way that we should educate the American people about what's going on, about what the president's attitudes are towards things, what his explanations are for the actions that he's taken, and so on. And that is not possible when he's giving a one-sentence quick answer to a reporter over his shoulder as he's walking from one place to another. So while these press conferences can be theater, as Press Secretary Psaki rightly told me, at the same time, they can be very valuable for the American people, and also for the rest of the world, to be able to see an American president, regularly, one would hope, answering questions from large amounts of American media shows how our democracy in action in a way that you can't see, obviously, in many other countries that don't do that.
Great, thank you so much. Did that answer your question, Lauren?
Yes, thank you.
Great. I think Patsy is next. If you wouldn't mind stating your name and affiliation, that'd be great. Thanks.
Hi, thank you for doing this. I'm Patsy Widakuswara with Voice of America. And I kind of want to just pick up on the last point that you mentioned in terms of impact to international media freedom. I mean, it may be a little bit more obvious under the Trump administration, but can you give your assessment about that under the Biden administration? Thanks.
Yes, I think that the Trump administration had the attacks by the president on the American media, the fact that when he would meet with authoritarian leaders of other countries, quite often the two of them would make jokes or serious comments about the fact that they were cracking down on the media, and sometimes he was wistful about the fact that he couldn't do the same thing in this country, all of which was very damaging, I think, to press freedom around the world. And that's whereas in this administration has repeatedly, the president, the Secretary of State, the White House press secretary have repeatedly made clear their belief in the important role of a free press in a democracy. And the Secretary of State and the president did the same thing in terms of global press freedom too, particularly during the Democracy Summit last December.
Can I just follow up? Do you think there's a discrepancy between what Secretary Blinken and also the president are saying in terms of the role of media in a democracy, but also at the same time in the U.S. there is still very much limiting that?
Yes, of course. There's also a discrepancy between what they've said about global press freedom and the lack of action that's been taken so far. Talking about Saudi Arabia, for example, and things that are going on in other countries where very little, at least action that one can see, has been taken place to assist journalists under fire in other countries. The State Department spokesman did tell me that they do things that are behind the scenes, that they try to jump on specific cases when they occur abroad. Obviously, CPJ knows more about that than I do. But outside of that, and the grants of money that were made to these international organizations only last month, there's been very little action taken to try to assist journalists under fire in other countries.
Thanks so much, Len. And Rob, I was wondering if you maybe wanted to jump in there and talk about some of the ways that CPJ has noted that the Biden administration could improve on protecting press freedom abroad.
Yes, just to amplify what Len was saying, I mean, I think it's important. Words are important. It's important that we make the commitments publicly. but it has to be followed up with action. And there are several things that we highlighted, whether it's the misuse of the Espionage Act, the full prosecution for those who murdered Jamal Khashoggi. These send a powerful signal that the United States would be serious about defending press freedom globally. And it's true that the administration does work behind the scenes. That's called diplomacy. But we need them to be out front and open in the way that they vigorously defend press freedom. As I said at the beginning of my remarks, we have record numbers of journalists in jail. It is a terrible time to be a journalist. There are more and more authoritarian countries, and we expect more of the United States than just a speech once a year.
Thanks so much. I think the next person in the queue is Matt Lee. Matt, if you wouldn't mind unmuting and asking your question.
Sure, thanks a lot, and appreciate it. Thanks for doing this. I noticed you mentioned the international aspect, and I wanted to know whether both of the guests think that the Biden administration is doing enough with international organizations. Saying having covered the UN, I know that the UN has a policy of banning all journalists from Taiwan, no matter what their media outlet. And I don't know if the State Department has acted on that, nor have they acted on. I'll be open. My case, where I was thrown out of the UN amid investigative reporting, asked the State Department to take action, haven't heard anything from them. And I also wanted to know, totally separately, domestically, on DOJ, you'd mentioned Merrick Garland. Do you think that the department is being open enough with, for example, trial exhibits in the January 6 cases and in the Ghislaine Maxwell trial just concluded? Thanks a lot.
I'll just say something briefly about the second part, and then Robert ought to address the first part. I've not followed that particularly closely because it's an active investigation, and my report was pretty much finished before that investigation became as active as it is now. And so, and also, I try not to. The reporters I interviewed did not address that particular subject. Let me put it that way.
Thanks.
Rob,
Rob, did you want to
talk? Yeah, I mean, we're focusing on the Biden administration here and not on the United Nations and its accreditation processes. I would say that there is more that the administration can do in terms of access. The Taiwan issue is not within the scope of this report. Katherine, maybe you, as the coordinator for the United States, could talk a little bit more about some of the granular details there in Matt's question.
Yeah, Matt, sorry, would you mind repeating your question and aspects that weren't answered?
Sure, thanks a lot. Hopefully I'm still, unmuted. What I was saying is that, the U.S. is obviously a P5 member. It has a major power inside the United Nations, and it's an organization sitting in New York City that says openly that there's an entire class of journalists that can't enter the building or become accredited in any way. So, you can decide whether that's within CPJ's scope of work, but it seems that the U.S., they've been asked, I know that, and I also know personally the State Department has been asked to have the UN have a basic, a content neutral accreditation system, which they don't. So those are my two questions. The Taiwan one may be an even simpler one. Should an organization in which the U.S. participates have a policy of banning an entire class of journalists with no comment at all from the United States State Department?
I think that's a bit outside of the scope of the report. I'd be really happy to address that after this at some point in time. If you don't mind emailing press@cpj.org, we can get in touch about that.
I appreciate it.
Okay, thanks so much. And next in our queue, I think we have Sansar. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your name. If you want to go ahead and unmute and give your name and affiliation, that'd be great. Thanks.
Good morning. Yes, my name is Sanjar Kamidov. I'm with Voice of America Russian Service. And my question is regarding Jamal Khashoggi murder. What steps, from your perspective, took Biden administration, along with towards the Saudi Arabia government in this particular issue? Thank you.
I'll tell you first what I was told by the State Department, that the president has refused to meet with the head of Saudi Arabia himself. and they've taken a variety of sanctions against some of the Saudis. However, at the same time, the National Security Advisor has met directly with the leader of Saudi Arabia, and this is something that the press freedom people that I interviewed for my report have condemned, and believe strongly that the stronger action needs to be taken against the leader of Saudi Arabia. Rob? Want to add to that?
Yeah, absolutely. You see, it sends a terrible signal because we are dealing with the murders of journalists all the time around the world. And most of the killers of journalists, 8 out of 10 killers of journalists, get away with it. Here we have a very clear state-sponsored murder of a prominent journalist, and the powerful leaders in Saudi Arabia, not the small fry, have not paid any political or diplomatic price for what they've done. The Biden administration can institute sanctions against the leader of Saudi Arabia himself if it so chooses. That would send a powerful signal. This murder has gone unpunished. And you can just imagine what you must feel like if you're an investigative journalist in any repressive country. If someone as prominent as Jamal Khashoggi, working for a world-renowned newspaper, can be brutally murdered and hacked up into pieces with impunity, what's that says for you in another smaller country, and you may not be quite so prominent. So this is a glaring case of impunity which cannot stand.
Thanks so much. And just a reminder that if you have any questions, please be sure to either raise your hand or drop them in the Q&A section. Now, one of mine, CPJ has very publicly followed the Assange extradition case with all of the twists and turns around it. What do you think why do you think the Biden administration has been reticent to drop the charges against the WikiLeaks founder? And do you see that changing anytime in the near future?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I should note that the Justice Department was very forthcoming to me about everything else in my report, as you can see from reading the report. However, they steadfastly refused to comment about the Assange case, which was an exception to the openness that all the rest of the government gave to me. So it's clearly something that's really important within the Justice Department about that I don't understand. Outside observers, journalists who cover justice, are still wondering whether or not, and press freedom advocates that I discussed this with, including at CPJ, are still wondering whether there are within the Justice Department career national security prosecutors for whom this is extremely important, and that so far the Attorney General has not decided to do anything about that. If you notice in the cases of the 3 cases of where there had been subpoenas of the records, phone and email records of reporters in leak cases that had carried over from the last administration. At the beginning of this administration, they were still kept secret until they finally were revealed, and then that led to the pressure from the president and from the press on the Attorney General to take the steps he took on that particular subject. The press freedom people I talked to wondered, why did that carry over? Why wasn't that dealt with immediately at the beginning of the administration? And we've also noticed some people that have left the Justice Department during this administration who were involved in those cases. So my question, which has not been answered, which I've not gotten answers to from the Justice Department, is whether or not there's still people within the department who have a different view about this case than we have.
Got it. Thanks so much. And Rob, do you have anything that you'd like to add about why the Assange case is so important and CPJ has been following it so much?
It's so important because the Espionage Act, which dates from 1917, was not used for many, many decades. Obama used it in several prosecutions against whistleblowers and people who divulged classified materials to reporters. Trump used it as well. And it sends a message that you can criminalize journalism and prosecuting journalists under a spy act. It also can be comfort to authoritarians elsewhere, because now we see that the United States can assume jurisdiction over a foreign national working outside of its territory, that has implications too. So all the First Amendment scholars and academics that we talk to, all the journalists that we talk to that work overseas, are very, very concerned about the implications if this prosecution continues to go ahead. Not only that, there is no real prosecutorial purpose served by keeping Julian Assange behind bars or bringing him to the United States. So we would like to see two things. We would like to see prosecutions under the Espionage Act of this kind dropped, and we would like to see Julian Assange let go and not extradited.
If I can just add the really worrisome thing about the Assange case is that the exact language in the revised indictment, the revision under the Trump administration, describes his interaction with Private Manning in a way that is exactly the same as investigative reporters every single day are dealing with potential sources for very important journalism. And so if it's found to be criminal in that case, that's a threat to all that kind of reporting.
Great, thank you both so much. Just a reminder that if you guys have any more questions, raise your hand or drop them in the Q&A part of the Zoom response thing. One more question from me, kind of turning to the positive now, and Len, you kind of touched on this a bit just now, but the Justice Department has stopped using federal subpoenas of reporters' telephone and email records. How significant is this change given the use of such subpoenas under the previous two administrations? Can you just kind of contextualize this for us?
This is a major, major change. Very, very important. At the same time, when you read the memo carefully from the Attorney General's memo on this, of course, there have to be exceptions in cases where reporters really do break the law, not in their work, but in other ways. And so that has to be an exception, for example. But there's just still gray areas. Who is a journalist, for example, who would be covered by this? And how could prosecutors get around the prohibition somehow by describing somebody who is a journalist as not being a journalist, for example? So that's why it's extremely important, and why media organizations and their lawyers are still going to meet again with the Justice Department when the drafting of the actual guidelines are done for U.S. attorneys, to be sure that the definition of journalist is as broad as it can be in this digital age, and that what exceptions that are carved out look reasonable, and that this prohibition really will stand.
And do you think it's realistic to see that these changes will be codified rather than just simply the guidelines modified as they currently are?
Well, yeah, press freedom advocates that I interviewed, of course, would like Congress to pass a law to codify this into law, but I see that being very unlikely. It's even in Congresses that you might think were more disposed towards press freedom in the United States, have so far not passed laws such as shield laws, for example. Even though many states have shield laws now, Congress has still not passed a shield law. So I'm not very hopeful about Congress taking any good action in this area.
Very fair, very fair. Rob, do you have anything to add to that? I also see that.
No, thanks. Len covered that.
I see that Ian Williams has a question. If you wouldn't mind stating your name and your affiliation, that'd be great. Thanks. Ian? Does Ian Williams have a question? Okay, I don't know if we're having technical difficulties. If not, do you guys, Rob and Len, do you guys have anything that we haven't touched on that you think is really important that you'd like to emphasize?
I don't think so in my case.
No, I would just like to, the report is titled Night and Day. And I think that, that fairly reflects the improvement in both the tone and some of the substance of this administration. Nevertheless, I think it's only fair to point out that there is still a long way to go. Len has touched on all the points that where improvement is needed. But I think that I would just end by saying it is vitally important in a democracy, especially a democracy which seems to be imperiled at home from the incredible divisiveness that we see at the moment, that journalists can do their jobs properly, have access to accurate and timely information, and that they are treated with a certain amount of respect for carrying out that role. This is beginning to happen, but we still have a ways to go. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And I see that Ian is now unmuted. Sorry to divert us from some very nice closing remarks, but Ian, do you still have a question? Perhaps not. Okay. Well, in that case, thank you guys all so much for attending. Len, thank you for the excellent report, which you guys should all check out on CPJ's website. And if there are any follow-up questions, please email cpj@press.org. Thank you guys so much for attending, and have a great day.
Thank you, Katherine.
Thanks.